A woman dressed in a flowing white wedding gown stood in front of the altar. Her gown, though old and torn, seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. Her veil hung down over her face, obscuring her features. Her presence was both captivating and terrifying, an ethereal beauty caught between the worlds of the living and the dead. She stood perfectly still, her back turned toward Caroline, her hands gently clasped in front of her. The room was silent, save for the soft rustle of the woman's gown. Caroline's breath caught in her throat as she realized the woman wasn't alone. Standing in the shadows was another figure, a man, also dressed in wedding attire, but his face was shadowed, indistinct, as though he wasn't meant to be seen. Suddenly, the woman in the white gown turned to face Caroline. Her veil was gone, and the pale, hollow eyes staring back at her were not those of a living soul. They were eyes filled with infinite sadness, grief, and longing. The woman's lips parted and a soft, trembling voice filled the air. "He never came back for me." Caroline froze, her skin prickling with a cold that seeped into her very soul. The woman took a step toward her, her movements slow and deliberate. The ground beneath Caroline's feet seemed to shift as though the earth itself was sinking under the weight of the woman's sorrow. "You're just like me," the phantom bride continued, her voice barely a whisper. "You loved him and he's gone. But now, you will stay with me, in this place, forever." Before Caroline could respond, the man in the shadows stepped forward. The sight of him made her heart stop. He was no longer the man she had once known, no longer the man she had lost. His face was gaunt, pale, and cracked like the earth itself. His eyes were black, empty voids. He reached for her, but his touch was cold and lifeless, like the touch of death itself. "James?" Caroline gasped, her voice a broken whisper. But it wasn't James. It couldn't be. This was something else entirely. Something twisted. Something bound to the cemetery. Bound to the phantom bride's endless longing. The phantom bride laughed, a sound like the wind howling through the dead trees. Her laughter echoed, bouncing off the chapel's walls, growing louder and louder, until it was deafening. It felt as though the very walls of the cemetery were closing in, trapping Caroline in the space between the living and the dead. Suddenly, the ground beneath Caroline gave way, and she fell. But it wasn't the floor that caught her. No, she fell into the depths of the cemetery itself, into the graves, into the cold embrace of the earth, into the place where lost souls linger. The darkness closed in around her, suffocating and overwhelming. She opened her eyes, but it wasn't the cemetery she saw anymore. It was a vision, a glimpse of the past. Margaret stood at the altar, her face radiant with love and hope, surrounded by the townspeople. But as Margaret turned, her smile faded, replaced by a look of despair as she realized Thomas wasn't there. Then, the vision shifted, and Caroline saw Margaret again, wandering the cemetery, calling out for her lost love. Her voice echoed, blending with Caroline's own cries. Caroline reached out, but her hands grasped nothing but air. Margaret's figure began to dissolve, fading into nothingness, her voice swallowed by the silence. But just before she vanished, Caroline saw her face again, hollow, grief-stricken, and forever searching. "Join me," Margaret whispered, her voice faint but clear. "You'll never leave this place. We are bound together, forever lost." Caroline felt herself being pulled deeper into the earth, her body becoming weightless. As she drifted into the darkness, she realized the truth. Margaret's love had never been lost. It had simply been waiting, for her. And as Caroline's vision blurred, she understood. She wasn't leaving Union Cemetery. She had become part of it, just like Margaret, forever. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting a pale, ghostly light across Union Cemetery. Its gravestones, cracked and weathered by time, seemed to whisper secrets to the wind. The trees loomed like twisted figures, their branches swaying, creaking as if trying to speak too. It was a place where the living rarely dared to tread, yet for some it was impossible to stay away. Caroline had always known there was something unsettling about Union Cemetery. It wasn't just the decaying headstones or the overgrown ivy that curled like fingers around forgotten memories. No, it was the legend, the one whispered by the townsfolk in hushed tones when the nights grew long. The Legend of the Phantom Bride. The story went like this. Many years ago, a beautiful young woman named Margaret had been promised to a man named Thomas. They were to be married on a crisp autumn evening, surrounded by the love of their friends and family. But fate had a cruel plan in store for them. On the eve of their wedding, Thomas was found dead, his body discovered at the foot of the cemetery's old chapel. Some said it was an accident. Others whispered of a jealous rival. But no one knew for sure. The only thing that was certain was that Margaret, heartbroken beyond belief, wandered the cemetery for weeks, calling for her lost love, until one night, she vanished without a trace. From that night onward, it was said that on every wedding anniversary, Margaret's spirit would return, forever searching for the man she would never marry. And so, the legend of the Phantom Bride was born. Caroline had heard the story as a child, of course, and dismissed it as one of those silly ghost tales that older people love to tell around campfires. But now, standing at the edge of the cemetery with only the sound of the wind to keep her company, she felt an inexplicable pull. It had been a year since she lost him. James, the man she had loved, the man she had planned to marry. A tragic accident had taken him from her, and since then, her life had been consumed with sorrow. She'd heard the whispers, seen the strange, inexplicable things that happened around the cemetery, but it wasn't the ghost stories that had drawn her here tonight. It was her own heartache, the gnawing emptiness that refused to let her go. As Caroline crossed the threshold of the cemetery, her breath caught in her throat. The temperature dropped, a chill that sank deep into her bones, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself. The air tasted like decay, like something long forgotten waiting to be unearthed. The gravel underfoot crunched with each step, disturbing the stillness of the graveyard. Caroline's mind raced as her boots dragged through the mist, each step heavier than the last, as if someone was pulling her forward. It felt as if the earth itself was reaching out, urging her to continue, to find something buried deep within these graves, within the forgotten whispers of this cursed land. She walked past crooked tombstones, the names of long-dead souls etched in faded stone. Some of the names were illegible, eroded by time and neglect, but others were freshly carved, hinting at those who had recently been added to the long list of lost souls. Each grave seemed to hold its own secret. The cemetery was a maze of twisted iron gates, sagging mausoleums, and crumbling crypts, each more haunting than the last. Caroline paused for a moment by a small, weathered gravestone that had a name she recognized. "James," she whispered to herself. Her throat tightened. She had never been able to bring herself to visit his grave before, but now, in the midst of the darkness, she felt the undeniable pull to his resting place. Her footsteps faltered, and she looked toward the old chapel in the distance. The chapel was the heart of Union Cemetery. From the moment she stepped onto the cemetery grounds, she had felt drawn toward it, as though an unseen force was guiding her. The structure was tall and looming, its stone walls covered with ivy that seemed to creep ever inward, as if attempting to swallow the building whole. Dark windows stared down like cold, hollow eyes. It had been abandoned for years, and its once pristine roof had long since crumbled, leaving behind only the skeletal remains of its former glory. Caroline's heart pounded as she slowly approached the chapel. She could feel her pulse quicken, each step taking her deeper into the mystery, the haunting grip of something ancient and restless. There was no turning back now. The door of the chapel creaked open on its own, revealing the dim glow of candlelight that flickered along the walls. But the light didn't seem to come from any physical candles. It appeared to shimmer and shift, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for Caroline as she stepped inside. She gasped, unsure of what she was seeing, but the figure that appeared before her was unmistakable.